Hello and welcome to the Death Mountaineers YouTube channel. My name is Maikeru. Today I wanted to talk about something pretty important pertaining to games and the game industry. That would be game design. What is good game design and what is, well, not good game design? As this has been a relatively controversial topic lately, and with the AAA game developers gradually losing sight of what makes games fun and why, I figured why not throw in my 2 cents. These are, however, simply my opinions, and I encourage you to write your own in the comments below and get the conversation started, as in the end, that's really what we're here for, isn't it? Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, when we play games, we're supposed to be locked in and engaged to these worlds. They're a gateway to another reality, ones of gritty war, the post-apocalypse, and viral infestation. Yet it is easy to forget that these worlds, these experiences, were carefully crafted by tens or even hundreds of people whose ideas and talents all gel together to create our beloved pastime. And with each and every one of these people lie a great many conscious decisions that culminate and shape the end process of a video game. And that's where the topic of game design comes in. It's a phrase that's been thrown around quite a bit over the past few years and has been the topic of much discussion and analysis across the internet. But what is game design? And how do you have good game design? Well, the former is pretty simple. It's how someone designs a game or a specific aspect of a game, and the intentional choices they make throughout the development of that aspect. I know, I'm blowing your minds. But although it may seem easy to associate it mainly with programmers and level designers, it is not quite the case, as almost every creative process has somewhat of an effect on the overall game, and by association, its design. So because this should be a relatively simple concept, we're going to take a look at a relatively simple game. For example, Sonic the Hedgehog. These loops here were designed by someone through the concept stage, the modeling stage, and into the level design as a small part of a greater picture, which is the rest of the stage. Same could be said with these spring pads, which were designed to launch Sonic in a specific direction at high speeds, or these spikes, which are an obstacle that can harm Sonic and should therefore be avoided. These were all created and implemented into a stage to fulfill an overall level design, as well as being pieces of a general game design that make playing the game more enjoyable. But how do these simple set pieces make that game more enjoyable? Well, the aim of game design is to vary parts of a game and hope to enrich a player's experience by making it more enjoyable through a variety of methods. But we still haven't answered what is good game design. This is a slightly more complex question, as good is a subjective term, and it really depends on what the aim of the developer was when designing the game and what the overall effect was. So why not first look at different types of game design? So let's first look at player direction and education. This is done by using visual cues in-game to signal the player about a mechanic or something they haven't seen before. This could be blatant, like showing a new enemy's quirk before facing it, or using collectibles to inadvertently learn the new mechanic. This type of level design works especially within games that have a lack of a standard tutorial or have non-explicit narratives. But let's jump back to Sonic real quick. For example, in Green Hill Zone Act 1, there are wooden bridges with robo-piranhas that jump up and try to attack anyone that goes by. The only way to defeat them is to jump on them. So what the game does is subtly teaches the player their weaknesses by providing a trail of rings above the ground in the path of the piranhas. The player will see the rings and will try to jump to collect them. They will most likely collide with the piranhas, which will teach the player 2 things. A, wooden bridges have piranhas, and B, jumping on piranhas will defeat them. If the rings were along the ground instead, this would have been a less effective lesson.
Oh no!
The player would have been damaged by the piranhas and would be frustrated by their progression being halted for a reason that was out of their control, thus taking them out of the experience, which is the last thing you want from a game. The pattern of rings above piranhas is repeated over and over throughout the stage to make sure that the players have an understanding of what the piranhas do and how to surpass them. Another example of good game design is challenge, not necessarily difficulty. This is done by designing and placing obstacles or enemies for the player to overcome. So let's look back at the spikes, again in Sonic the Hedgehog. Colliding with the spikes will immediately damage our little blue meme machine, but not kill him. He will lose all his rings as a penalty and is given a grace period of invulnerability, where he can quickly retain some of his lost rings. This makes sense as it is a children's game. It's meant to be given a bit of leeway and to be forgiving, but not to the point where there is no challenge. The spikes also provide easy tension and tricky platforming challenges. The players will obviously not want to jump on the spikes, which will lead to unease, as one wrong move could lead to their deaths. Clearing that jump jump would release the tension and replace it with the satisfaction of overcoming a difficult obstacle, a very simple way to reward the player for some tricky platforming. Now, overall, the implementation of good game design is used to enrich a player's experience. Giving examples of this is a little bit abstract, and it's more subtle and harder to pick up, especially since it can be done in so many ways to achieve many things, but can also seem insignificant at the same time. In order to highlight this achievement, I'm going to show 3 different examples instead of a singular one. Now we return once again to Sonic the Hedgehog, this time looking at a key aspect of his character, which of course is speed. Sonic only goes fast after building enough momentum, and one of his most famous uses for his speed is moving through the iconic loop-de-loop. This is important and unique because if not enough speed is accumulated, Sonic will simply fall flat on his face, yet if Sonic is going fast enough, he'll zip through the loop with ease. Giving you an idea of exactly how fast Sonic is actually going, knowing that the centrifugal force is keeping him glued to this loop. This shows the player that good reflexes and memorization are going to be rewarded within the game with speed, and speed is meaningful because it allows you to continue to progress at the pace which you would like to be going. In the first game, this is especially significant because Sonic was not equipped with his spin dash, which allowed instant boosts of speed, regardless of any previous build-up. Dead Cells is another game which aims to enrich players' experiences through game design. It's a fast-paced Metroidvania-ish roguelike which relies on the player being clever with the tools that are given to them within the game. However, in order for the player to feel clever and to get the rewards that come from that cleverness, the game has to be intuitive, challenging, but also fair. Dead Cells itself is so tightly designed that many observations of well-implemented game design could be made, but I wanted to focus on a smaller, much overlooked aspect. The game is all about fast-paced action and split-second decision-making, and it can be very easy to be swept up by the heat of the moment and go a little overkill on enemies. And sometimes you can mistakenly lead them off a ledge to their doom. In many other games, that would be that. The enemy's dead and all the precious loot they had slipped into the abyss, but not in Dead Cells. In this game, all the loot is spawned from where the enemy fell, without tempting the player down a spike pit. A simple, almost insignificant mechanic, yet the game is accommodating the player in a fair way, as if to say there is no need to handicap yourself. And my last example is very simple. The save feature within Hitman, Blood Money, and Hitman 2016 allows for an almost infinite number of save slots, which save and load near instantaneously. This works particularly well for Hitman because it's both a stealth game where a single mistake will blow your cover, as well as encouraging the player to experiment and dispatch their targets in unique and wacky ways, and the fast save/load system enables the player to get right back to it immediately. A similar design is often placed inside arcade-style games, which allows you to instantly restart a mission. If this is coupled with a quick load time, it makes for a smoother and much more enjoyable experience. Now, when shown the building blocks of games, these decisions become more and more evident, showing the awe-inspiring attention to detail and love that the developers can pour into their games. Even older ones that seem like little is hidden in plain view still emanate that painstaking detail just below the surface. The Ocarina of Time, for example, is a masterpiece in terms of innovation, scope, and general enjoyment that can be wrung out of the game. The added third dimension creates an insurmountable amount of detail that the SNES couldn't hope to accomplish. This includes silly Easter eggs, observant hints to environmental puzzles, and the genius implementation of the time travel mechanic. These aspects wrap up into a wonderful game with great design that was not only implemented over and over again in the future, but was also pioneering in the emerging genre of 3D games. But as we've discussed, good design is subjective, and it does help to identify it by contrasting it against poor design decisions. Not to say that these games are bad, but decisions within them have somewhat tainted the overall experience, which show the game in a negative light. Starting once again with Sonic the Hedgehog as our simple example, we can look at a few of the more unfavorable choices within the game, like the odd use of iframes. Iframes, or invincibility frames, is a short grace period where a character becomes invulnerable for a few seconds after being hit. This usually allows for the player to recuperate and gather their bearings, but in Sonic the Hedgehog, being damaged launches the player backwards as well, and the iframes are only triggered after touching the ground once more. Even though getting launched back is annoying and is something that can be difficult to compensate for, especially when you get knocked into a pit of spikes, which is an instant KO combo, there's also the insta-death crushing mechanic, which many people have dealt with and complained about in the Sonic the Hedgehog series. This happens when a platform or the screen reaches a ceiling of some sort, and Sonic the Hedgehog instantly dies. Now, in some situations, this makes intuitive sense, but then in other situations, you'll find yourself randomly dying when it doesn't even look like you got crushed, which is a problem with bad hitboxes. Now, iframes are generally seen as a forgiving mechanic, but a lack of iframes aren't necessarily a bad thing either, since games like Hyper Light Drifter have little to no iframes, but are still regarded as very good games. This is due to the absence of iframes being built around many of the core mechanics and being woven into the extra challenge of the game. This brings us to the odd topic of difficulty in games. Personally, I despise the concept of difficulty in a game. Difficulty is an inherently bad thing. Challenge and difficulty are completely different. Games that are too easy can lead to feelings of disengagement and repetition. On the other hand, a very difficult game can feel cheap and unfair, frustrating the player as it's completely beyond their ability. The way I look at it is this: challenge is challenge. You have to learn something in order to overcome a challenge. You have to grow. Difficulty, or its synonym hardness, expresses an issue with design. For example, Dark Souls is challenging, but completing Five Nights at Freddy's is hard, specifically because Five Nights at Freddy's, unlike Dark Souls, is not fair. A lot of it is based on random number generation. This is why finding a perfect difficulty is so difficult, because it has to be challenging, but fair, doable, yet not insultingly easy. Once again, looking at Sonic, surpassing glitches, frame drops, simply falling through platforms is difficult because it's unfair, random, poorly designed, and lazy. There's no challenge there, it's simply lucking through a hard spot, whereas games like Nioh or the Soulsborne games from FromSoft are seen as hard, which turns a lot of people off, but in reality they are simply challenging. They're always beatable, but that task is up to you, your practice, and your intuition. Another poor example of game design could be seen in Yooka-Laylee and their random scattering of the game's collectibles, quills. They're strewn about each map with no coherent path or focused reasoning. They often felt like they were there just for the sake of existing. This made it feel like it was a chore to seek them out and quickly became a tedious task. Not only that, but the control of the game made it very difficult to collect these as well, which should be the most simple thing within the game's mechanics. None of this satisfied the collectathon itch it promised to scratch. Now, if you compare this to the game's spiritual successor, Banjo-Kazooie, and its collectible equivalent, Notes, we see what Yooka-Laylee was attempting to emulate to a varying degree of success. Notes were placed along very direct paths, which eventually branched out into the unique landmarks of each world. This familiarized the player with the world before they were off on their own without their note-shaped training wheels. Each string of notes was meaningful, they all had their specific place, and guided players through the charming and memorable worlds, oozing with personality and character, whether it be to a jiggy, a life, or a secret. Each note had its own importance, and each was truly meaningful, which is what Yuka failed to understand, which ended up hindering the game as a whole. What we as players are looking for is simple. 1. Intuitive control. For instance, we can look at Rayman Legends, a complex platformer with many button variations used to navigate its numerous stages. Not once did I feel confused or unable to do something when it came to control, and not once did I have to seek the guide for help learning control. It came naturally and easily, and the game was about as fluid as a game can be. 2. An engaging environment. This can be anything from the enemies to set pieces, but there has to be a reason to take a look. Why are we here? Who are these creatures? What is the significance of the area I'm in as pertaining to the narrative I'm following, be it written or implied? 3. Challenge. A scaling difficulty that creates situations which allows a player to feel as if they've overcome an obstacle, be it puzzles, tough bosses, or simply an intensity of gameplay they had to learn to cope with. The inevitable goal of games is to make us feel like we did something and give us a reason to transfer our time with that game from short-term to long-term memory. Because in the end, that's what we're left with is memories, and everybody has some of their favorite games and probably has some of their least favorite games as well. But what do you think? What are your favorite games and why? What aspects of them were good and which could have been refined? Personally, I've been looking back into Super Mario World on my SNES Classic and beating it for the millionth time, simply admiring how well that game was put together. I'd like to send a shout out to Gaffa Cakes, for without him this episode would have never seen the light of day, as I've been crazy busy lately with the moving and writing and editing for Treeskull. Gaffa Cakes took it upon himself to not only come up with the concept, but also write the majority of this episode and to give a helping hand by editing it as well. So if you like the way this looks, give him some love in the comments. I appreciate his hard work and dedication so much. And speaking of which, I encourage those of you who have the means to give our Patreon a look. We're trying to grow a presence there to show YouTube that we will survive with or without their help as content creators, and simply by donating $1 a month, you are helping us out in a way that we cannot describe. It is so important right now with YouTube absolutely just destroying the possibility of people being able to grow and to get their content out to as many people as possible on YouTube. It's very complex, and I'd like to do a video on it in the future, so if you're interested in that, let me know. But in the meantime, don't forget to leave a like if you liked the video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and stay tuned for Pokemon Mythos Busters landing soon. Until then, I'll see you next time.